The billionaire groom refused to pay, until the flower girl spoke one word. A woman stood in the doorway of the most expensive wedding venue in all of Connecticut, and she was crying. Not softly. Not the kind of tears you dab away with a tissue. She was crying the way people cry when they realize everything they built is about to be taken from them. Her name was Clara Bennett. She was 61 years old. She had spent 32 years building something beautiful with her hands, and in less than 10 minutes, a man worth $4 billion had decided her work meant nothing. Security was already walking toward her. Phones were already pointed at her. And the whispers were already spreading through that crystal-lit hall like a slow fire. But just before they reached her, just before the humiliation became complete, a little girl stepped out of the flower girl line, walked directly up to the billionaire groom, and whispered one single word into his ear. And what happened next didn't just stop the wedding. It unraveled a secret that had been buried for over 40 years. Stay with me, because this story is not really about money. It never was. It was about a promise a hungry boy made at a kitchen table, and the woman he forgot he ever made it to. Before we get to that moment, before we get to that one word, we have to understand who Julian Vane really was. Because the world thought they knew him. Magazines called him a self-made genius. Business journals called him ruthless but brilliant. His employees called him untouchable. But none of them had ever asked the right question. Not one journalist, not one profile writer, not one investor sitting across from him at a mahogany table had ever asked, "Where did you come from before the money?" And the answer to that question is the only reason any of this story matters. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Clara Bennett grew up believing that beauty was not something you purchased. It was something you grew. Her mother kept a small garden behind their house in rural Vermont, and Clara spent her childhood learning the names of every flower in it. Roses, dahlias, peonies, lavender, wild chamomile. By the time she was 12, she could arrange a bouquet that made grown women tear up at church. By the time she was 26, she had taken out a small loan, rented a storefront on the edge of a quiet town called Millhaven, and opened Bennett's Blooms. The shop was small. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it from the outside. A hand-painted sign. A wooden front door that stuck a little in the rain. 2 display windows that Clara filled with color every single morning before the sun came all the way up. But inside, something rare happened every day. People came in for flowers and left feeling like they had been seen. Clara had a gift for listening. A grieving husband would walk in asking for something simple for his wife's grave, and Clara would spend 20 minutes asking him what she loved. What color made her laugh? What flower she always stopped to smell? And then Clara would build something that made the man cry in the good way. She charged him whatever he could afford. That was just who she was. The shop survived 3 recessions. It survived a flood in 2009 that destroyed her back storage room. It survived the death of her husband, Gerald, who passed quietly in his sleep in 2017 after 31 years of marriage. Clara had stood at his grave with a bouquet of white gardenias, his favorite, and she had whispered, "I'm going to be okay." And somehow, she always had been. But by the spring of 2023, things were different. Foot traffic had slowed. Online flower delivery companies had taken a chunk of her regular customers. Her lease had gone up. And for the first time in 32 years, Clara Bennett was looking at the numbers and feeling afraid. Julian Vane's public story began at Stanford, where he supposedly coded his first software platform in a dorm room and sold it 6 years later for $200 million. That's the version his PR team had polished and repeated so many times it had become gospel. But the real story started somewhere much colder. Julian grew up in a small town called Grover's Creek in eastern Tennessee. His father left when he was 4. His mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on most winters. By the time Julian was 9 years old, he understood hunger in a way that most children in America never do. Not the kind of hunger that makes you reach for a snack. The kind that sits in your stomach like a stone and doesn't move. The kind you fall asleep with. The kind you wake up with. The kind that makes you quiet in a room full of loud children because you're afraid if you speak too much, someone will notice how empty you are. There was a woman on his street named Margaret. Margaret Ellis. She was in her 70s, soft-spoken, and grew the most extraordinary flower garden anyone in Grover's Creek had ever seen. Her front yard was a riot of color all spring and summer. Neighbors would slow down just driving past it. Margaret had never had much money either. But she had something Julian's household lacked entirely, abundance of heart. She noticed the boy. She noticed how he walked home from school alone, how his clothes were always a little too thin for the weather, how he sometimes stopped in front of her gate and just stared at the garden without saying a word. One Tuesday afternoon in October, she called out to him. "You hungry, son?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at the ground. "Come on in," she said. And he did. Margaret fed Julian beef stew and cornbread that afternoon. She fed him dinner twice a week for the next 4 years. She never made him feel like a charity case. She just set a plate and talked to him like he mattered. She asked him about school. She showed him her flowers. She told him once, while he was helping her clip the dead heads off her roses, that there was a reason flowers kept blooming even after the cold. "They don't know how to give up," she said. "And neither should you." Julian never forgot that. He went to school on a scholarship. He coded at night. He worked. He climbed. He became everything the world now called him. But somewhere between the poverty and the boardrooms, he had buried Margaret. He had buried Grover's Creek. He had buried the stew and the cornbread and the garden and the boy who stood at a gate staring at flowers because they were the only beautiful thing in his world. He buried it so deep he had convinced himself it was gone. That's the thing about the past. It doesn't die just because you stop talking about it. In February of 2023, Julian Vane announced his engagement to a woman named Diane Harlow, a Manhattan art curator he had been dating for 14 months. The wedding was planned for May. The venue was the Greystone Hall in Greenwich, Connecticut. 280 guests. Crystal chandeliers. A string quartet. A catered menu designed by a chef who had cooked for 3 sitting presidents. The wedding planner, a sharp woman named Rachel Mears, was working through a vendor list that stretched across 2 pages when she passed through Millhaven on a different errand and noticed a flower shop. The window display stopped her cold. It was stunning. Arranged like a painting, layered, intentional, alive in a way that expensive floral designers often forgot to make things look. She went inside. She met Clara. And 40 minutes later, she called Julian's assistant with a recommendation. The order she proposed was enormous. 12,000 individual stems. 42 custom arrangements. Floral arches, centerpieces, aisle runners, a cascading installation above the head table that would take Clara and her 2 part-time helpers 3 full days to assemble. The total came to $118,000. To Julian, that was a rounding error. To Clara, it was a lifeline. She signed the contract in March. She immediately reinvested every cent of her savings into the order. She bought specialty blooms from suppliers in California and the Netherlands. She hired 2 additional helpers for the week of the wedding. And then, in late April, when she realized the scale of what she had committed to was going to outpace even her reinvestment, she did something she had never done in 32 years of business. She mortgaged her home. A small blue house on Elm Street in Millhaven that she and Gerald had bought together in 1991. The house where her daughter had grown up. The house that still had Gerald's workbench in the garage. She mortgaged it to fund flowers for a billionaire's wedding. She told herself it was fine. The contract was signed. Payment was due the morning of the ceremony, per the terms Rachel had laid out. Everything was approved in writing. Everything was confirmed. Clara had done everything right. Clara and her team arrived at Greystone Hall at 5 in the morning on the day of the wedding. The venue was magnificent. High ceilings, polished marble floors, walls that caught the morning light and turned it gold. Clara stood in the doorway for just a moment before anyone else arrived, and she let herself feel it. Pride. Real pride. The kind that doesn't come from arrogance but from having poured yourself entirely into something and watching it become more than you imagined. By 9 in the morning, the installation above the head table was complete. Soft white peonies and trailing greenery cascading down like a waterfall. By 11, the aisle was done. Jasmine and garden roses in ivory and blush, exactly as approved in the contract. The floral arches framed the ceremony space like something from a dream. Clara stood back and looked at all of it, and she allowed herself, for just one quiet second, to feel safe. Then Julian Vane arrived. He came in through the side entrance at 11:40 with his assistant and 2 members of his security team. He walked the space the way executives walk spaces, assessing, calculating. His eyes swept over the arrangements. He paused at the aisle. He paused at the arches. He said nothing. Clara approached him carefully. She introduced herself. She held out the invoice, her voice calm and professional. "Mr. Vane, the balance is due before the ceremony per our contract. $118,000. Julian took the papers. He looked at them for a long moment. Clara waited. She had done this enough times to know that the wealthy could be slow to respond. She was prepared for questions. She was prepared for negotiation. She was not prepared for what he said next. He handed the papers back. "This isn't what I ordered." Clara blinked. "I'm sorry. The roses along the aisle. I specified garden roses in cream and champagne. These red as pink." Clara kept her voice even. "Sir, the color swatch was approved in writing on March 14th. The blush tones were specifically confirmed by Rachel Mears, your wedding planner. Rachel doesn't have the authority to confirm color. That should have come to me. Mr. Vane, the approval chain in the contract clearly states, I don't pay for disappointment." He said it the way someone says the weather forecast. Flat. Final. Like the words cost him nothing because they didn't. The first few guests had already begun arriving. The hall was beginning to fill with the quiet sounds of a formal gathering. Heels on marble. Soft greetings. The string quartet warming up. And in the middle of all of it, Clara Bennett stood holding an invoice for $118,000 while a man 4 times her net worth told her he didn't intend to pay it. "Mr. Vane," she said, and her voice was still steady, though her hands were not, "I mortgaged my home to fulfill this order. Every detail was approved in writing. I have the documentation. I have the email chain. I have Rachel's signed confirmation." Julian looked past her. Literally past her. As if she had finished speaking and the conversation was over. "I'll have legal reach out to you next week." He turned to his assistant. "Make sure no one lets her disrupt the ceremony." And that was it. He walked away. 2 members of the event security team began moving toward Clara. Not aggressively. Just purposefully. The way people move when they want you to understand that your presence is no longer welcome. Clara felt the room tilt. She thought of Gerald. She thought of the house on Elm Street. She thought of the mortgage. She thought of the 3 months of work, the flights to California to inspect the specialty blooms, the nights she had spent at her workbench pressing dried samples to compare against the approved swatches. She had done everything right. She had done absolutely everything right. And her eyes filled with tears. A guest nearby noticed. Then another. Phones came out. Not many, but enough. Whispers crossed the hall like a current. And Clara, who had never cried in front of a client in 32 years, was crying now. Desperately. Because she understood what was happening. She was about to lose her house. And there was nothing she could do. Be honest with yourself for a moment. Have you ever witnessed someone use their power to crush someone who had no power left? Have you ever stood in a room and watched something deeply wrong happen and felt that paralysis, that horrible stillness, where you want to do something but don't know what? Tell me in the comments how you would have reacted if you had been standing in that hall. Because what happened next, none of those guests expected it. None of them. The flower girls were lined up near the entrance to the main aisle. There were 4 of them, daughters and nieces of Diane's friends, all between the ages of 5 and 8. They wore soft ivory dresses. They each held a small wicker basket of rose petals. They had been rehearsed. They knew their cues. They were supposed to stand quietly until the processional music began. 3 of them did exactly that. The 4th one did not. Her name was Lily. She was 7 years old, and she belonged to none of the wedding party. She was the daughter of one of Clara's part-time helpers, a young woman named Sophie who had been working at Bennett's Blooms for 2 years. Sophie had brought Lily along that morning because she had no childcare, and because Rachel Mears had told her it was fine, that it was a big venue and the little girl could stay near the back and watch. Someone from the venue staff, trying to be kind, had added Lily to the flower girl line so she wouldn't feel left out. She had been given a basket of petals and told to follow along. Lily had spent the entire morning watching her mother and Clara work. She had watched Clara on her knees at 5 in the morning, threading stems through wire frames. She had watched Clara climb a ladder 3 times to adjust the cascading installation above the head table. She had heard Clara on the phone with a supplier at 6:15, making sure a last-minute replacement bloom had been shipped correctly. She had watched all of it. And then she had watched Julian Vane hand the invoice back. She had watched security walk toward Clara. She had watched Clara cry. Lily stepped out of the flower girl line. There was a gasp from the 2 women nearest to her. One of them reached out to take her by the shoulder and pull her back. Lily moved around the hand without looking at it. She was 7 years old and she walked like she had somewhere to be. Her shoes made soft sounds on the marble. Guests turned. Security hesitated, because what do you do when a 7-year-old child walks toward the groom with purpose in her eyes? Julian saw her coming. He frowned. He looked at his assistant. His assistant shrugged. Lily stopped directly in front of him. She was so small. The top of her head barely reached his chest. She looked up at him with dark eyes that held no fear and no performance, just a kind of certainty that made several grown adults in that room feel something they couldn't name. Julian opened his mouth to say something dismissive. He was Julian Vane. He did not get interrupted by children. But Lily leaned forward first. She rose onto her tiptoes. She cupped her small hands around her mouth. And she whispered one word into his ear. The room was quiet enough that people could see his face change. Not gradually. Immediately. Like a switch had been thrown somewhere deep inside him. The color left his face in a single wave. His jaw moved but no sound came out. His eyes, which had been cold and certain all morning, went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that was not that hall. Somewhere that looked, to the guests watching, like a very long time ago. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this amazing story. The word Lily whispered was not Julian. It was a nickname. 1 word. 3 syllables. A nickname that only one person in Julian Vane's entire life had ever used. Margaret Ellis had called him Junebug. She had started calling him that the first afternoon she fed him stew. She said he reminded her of a June bug, bumping into everything, trying to figure out which direction was up, but never stopping moving. He had been embarrassed by it as a boy. He had grown to love it in secret. He had never told anyone about it. Not a college roommate, not a business partner, not a therapist, not Diane. No one alive on earth knew that nickname. Except, apparently, this child. Julian's knees didn't buckle. Men like Julian don't let their knees buckle in public. But he swayed slightly. His assistant put a hand on his arm and he shrugged it off. He looked down at Lily. His voice came out in a whisper that still carried to the people closest to him. "Where did you hear that?" Lily looked at him calmly. "My great-grandma told me," she said. "She said if I ever met a man named Julian who forgot to be kind, I should say it. She said he'd understand." Clara was being guided toward the exit by security when she heard the commotion stop. She turned. She saw Julian Vane standing motionless in the middle of the hall. She saw the flower girl looking up at him. She did not yet understand what had passed between them. But Julian understood everything. He understood it all in the space of one breath. Clara Bennett. Bennett's Blooms. Millhaven, Vermont. He had looked it up, vaguely, when Rachel first brought the name to his assistant. He had not connected it. Why would he? Vermont was a long way from Grover's Creek. But Margaret Ellis had a daughter. That daughter had moved north decades ago. That daughter had a daughter of her own. And that daughter, Clara Bennett, née Ellis, had spent 32 years making flowers the way her mother had always said flowers should be made. With care that costs you something. Julian had humiliated the daughter of the only person who had ever fed him when he was hungry. The daughter of the woman who had called him Junebug at her kitchen table and told him that flowers don't know how to give up. And neither should you. The realization didn't come gently. It came like cold water. Julian Vane did something no one in that hall had ever seen him do. He walked past his assistant. He walked past the security team. He walked directly to Clara Bennett, who was standing near the side exit with reddened eyes and the invoice still folded in her hand. He stopped in front of her. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, this man who was worth $4 billion, this man whose name was on buildings and tech platforms and venture portfolios, and he looked at this woman holding a paper invoice for $118,000, and he looked, for just a moment, like the boy from Grover's Creek. Your mother's name was Margaret, he said. It wasn't a question. Clara's eyes widened. Her breath caught. She had the most beautiful garden in our town, Julian continued. His voice was different. Quieter. Slower. Like something that had been pressed very flat for a very long time was being carefully unfolded. She fed me when I had nothing. Twice a week for 4 years. She never made me feel like a burden. Not once. Clara had tears on her face again. But different tears now. She never told me, Clara whispered. She never told me your name. She just said she'd had a boy come around sometimes. A good boy. She said she always wondered what became of him. Julian looked at the invoice in her hand. He reached into the inside pocket of his wedding jacket and removed his phone. He handed it to his assistant with 2 words, pay it. The assistant looked at the invoice. He looked at Julian. Julian didn't repeat himself. His assistant opened the payment app. Julian turned back to Clara. 10 times the invoice. Today. Gasps moved through the hall like a wave. $312,000. Transferred in the time it took a string quartet to finish a measure. But here's what I want you to sit with. The money was not the point. Did you notice that? Because the room reacted to the number. The guests gasped. The phones came back out for a different reason now. But Julian and Clara weren't reacting to the number. They were standing very still in the middle of a hall that smelled like jasmine and garden roses, and they were both thinking about a woman with a flower garden in rural Tennessee who believed that kindness was the most abundant crop you could grow. How would you have felt in Clara's place? Walking out of that hall in tears, everything you owned on the line, and then hearing your mother's name come out of the mouth of the man who had just broken you? Tell me in the comments. The wedding did resume. Diane Harlow walked down that Jasmine Ann Rose aisle 40 minutes later than scheduled, and she was beautiful, and the ceremony was everything the planners had promised it would be. But something was different. The guests felt it without being able to name it exactly. Julian stood at the altar and he was present in a way that people who had been to his previous events had never seen him. Not performing presence. Actually present. Like a man who had just been handed back a piece of himself he had not known was missing. After the ceremony, during the reception, Julian sought Clara out. She was preparing to leave with her helpers. He asked her to stay. She did. They sat at a small table near the back of the hall while 280 guests danced, and Julian talked about Margaret for the first time in decades. He talked about the stew. He talked about the roses. He talked about October afternoons that he had locked away so completely he had half convinced himself they were invented. Clara listened. And then she told him things about her mother that he hadn't known. That Margaret had kept a small notebook of prayers, one for every person she had ever helped. That she had written his name in it. That she had written simply, "The boy. May he find his way back to himself." Clara had inherited the notebook when Margaret passed in 2019. She had never known who "the boy" was. 4 years later, sitting in a wedding hall in Connecticut surrounded by flowers she had grown with the same hands her mother had grown flowers with, she finally did. In the weeks after the wedding, Julian's legal team reached out to Clara, not with threats, but with a proposal. Julian had established a foundation in Margaret Ellis's name. He wanted to fund small, independent businesses in rural communities across the country. Businesses exactly like Bennett's Blooms. Businesses that were built on care rather than scale. He asked Clara if she would serve on the advisory board. She said yes. The mortgage on the blue house on Elm Street was paid off within the month. Clara didn't announce it. She didn't post about it. She went home that evening, sat on the porch where she and Gerald used to sit on summer nights, and she held the notebook her mother had left her. She turned to the page with the single word. "The boy." She took a pen from her pocket and she wrote, very gently, below it, "Found his way back." Sophie, her part-time helper, came back to work the following Monday. Lily came with her, the way she sometimes did when school was out. Clara gave her a small bunch of lavender and showed her how to strip the stems. Lily held the flowers carefully. The way you hold something you already understand matters. "There is something I want to ask you." Not rhetorically. Actually. Do you believe a person can forget who they are? Not pretend to be someone else, actually forget the version of themselves that knew what it felt like to be hungry, or scared, or helped by a stranger for no reason except decency. I think success can do that. Not always. But sometimes. It builds walls so high and so efficient that the person inside stops being able to see over them. And I think what happened in that hall, what a 7-year-old girl did with one whispered word, is a reminder that the past doesn't disappear because you stop looking at it. It waits. Sometimes it waits in the shape of a child with a basket of rose petals. Sometimes it waits in a notebook your mother kept. Sometimes it waits in the smell of jasmine on a May morning. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it finds you on the one day you need it most and reminds you that you were always more than what you became. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about someone who was kind to you when they had no reason to be, someone you may have forgotten, leave their name in the comments. Just their first name. A quiet kind of tribute. That's enough. And if you believe that kindness still has the power to reach into the hardest places and pull something real out, subscribe. Take care of your heart. And remember, the people who fed you when you were empty deserve to be remembered. Even if it takes you 40 years to say thank you.